Welcome to another edition of Play It Through, and this time around it's Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, brought to us by Konami. Now this is the second entry in the Castlevania series, and they took it in a much different direction. They made it a much more action-adventure style game, such as Zelda 2 or Battle of Olympus. And by doing so, just like with any game franchise when you change things up, some fans love it, and others hate it. So overall, this game has a mediocre reputation. So here we go with Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest for the NES. Now, when I start off this game, I'm actually going to be doing a little bit of training right at the start. So, to try to get through that pretty quickly, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the storyline and some other gameplay elements of the game that get on my nerves a little bit, to try to make the training whole thing go a little bit quicker than if I was just like talking about me actually training and telling you what was going on the actual screen. But in order to buy the items that we're going to need for later on, I do have to do this little bit of training. I shouldn't have to do much more, if any, throughout the rest of the run, but at the very beginning I do have to train a little bit. And to train, basically you just kill enemies. By killing certain enemies, they drop little hearts. Now, normally in the Castlevania series, the hearts represent the item system, how many times you can use a certain item. But in this one, they're the money system. It doesn't really make much sense that hearts would be used for money, but we'll just go with that aspect. And very quickly, after only a few minutes of going back and forth fighting the same enemies, it's going to switch over to the night system, which is, I think, everyone's biggest problem with the game. An interesting concept, but every single time it does switch, you have to look at the text, and it slowly scrolls by. I think probably every single person in the world knows about that text scrolling and the horribleness of switching from day to night. But it added a cool gameplay element. Like, you can't really talk to any of the citizens in the towns at night because they're all inside, afraid of all the demons and stuff that are roaming the town at night. And it kind of gives you a sense of, actual realism of having to deal with day and night. And also when playing the game, when you get used to it, judging how long you have between day and night to try to figure out if you're going to be able to make it to the next town between day and night, or should you just stay outside and train some more before going into the town. Now, time does continue in all areas except when you're inside of a dungeon, which doesn't make much sense, but when you're in a town or you're outside, the time system keeps going, so eventually it'll go back to day. Right now, of course, at night, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here, and it's a little easy area to train in order to, or I say train, or order to build up your money supply. Now, you do level up in the game as well. Picking up the items and on, killing enemies, you do level up. Your health will increase by leveling up. You also will upgrade your whip by buying new whips, which I will actually skip the second whip and just go right to the third whip. From there, I'll just have to buy one more whip, the fourth one, and then for the final whip, you actually just get an upgrade from this random guy who makes the whip a flame whip. It never runs out, seemingly. The fire can never go out, doesn't burn you, but either way, it's the best whip in the game. Also, let me just go ahead, like I mentioned, I was going to talk about the storyline a little bit of the game. Now, the Castlevania franchise, in general, has a pretty decent timeline now, but back then, since this was only the second game, there really wasn't any storyline to go through, and most video games, especially on the NES, unless you were a role-playing game, such as Dragon Warrior or Final Fantasy, you didn't have a whole lot of story. You had the manual, which sometimes was very horribly translated into English, and then you had the stuff that went on in the game. Now, you can talk to citizens in the town, and they will give you information and stuff. And at the very beginning, at the start menu, if you don't hit start right away, a little bit of story will come up, but it took a while later until I read some stuff about why exactly this game's happening, because what you're doing is you're going around the different mansions and collecting pieces of Dracula's body in order to resurrect him just to end up killing him again. I wasn't quite sure why you would go around and find Dracula just to kill him again. I mean, you killed him in the first game. But apparently the storyline of the game is, when you killed Dracula, you didn't destroy his body, you just beat him. He cursed you before he died. Basically, he cursed you that you're gonna end up slowly falling ill and dying. And if Simon Belmont dies, there's gonna end up being, no more Belmonts in order to fight Dracula. The only way to get rid of the curse is to find Dracula again, find his body, and burn his body. But Dracula was pretty smart and decided to tell all his minions to take his body, separate it into pieces, and put it all over different areas. So that if Simon figured out he had to burn the body, he was going to have to go around and find a lot more pieces of the body in different areas, it was going to take him a lot longer, and maybe he would never be able to accomplish the goal. Of course, that's the entire goal of this game, is to find those pieces and put them together and burn them alive, and then thus you get rid of the curse and he doesn't have to worry about anything. I guess Dracula knew Simon, I guess he didn't have a kid yet. Like, it doesn't make quite sense, because even if you were cursed and you were slowly falling ill, I don't know if the curse went along the entire family, or just Simon himself, in which case Simon could have a kid still, and that would continue the lineage. But I guess Dracula didn't have time to plan it out all the way, or there wasn't many, whatever. The game company, Konami, was just like, hey, at least it kinda makes sense. At least you have a point of why you're playing the game, which many NES games, you didn't have a point. There wasn't a need for a point. You just went from point A to point B, and enjoyed the mayhem that ensued in between. Now that the first night is over with, and I guess I've kind of explained a little bit of the story, it's time to actually go into the game. Yeah, I bought Holy Water, which is going to be one of the most useful items in the entire game. The Holy Water ends up being pretty much one of the most useful items in any Castlevania game, but especially in this one, because you use it not only to kill enemies, and I mean you can really mess up some enemies with it, not as good as an item we'll get later, but it also breaks open areas. Another big complaint about the game is when you're walking over certain pathways, all of a sudden you'll fall through because they're they're a pitfall. But you can use the Holy Water to throw, and not only you'll be able to see that, where certain pitfalls are, or you can just memorize them like I have, which I wouldn't recommend either. It becomes more fun of wasting and throwing tons and tons of Holy Waters to figure out where you can and can't walk, and once you fall through the first pitfall and realize that the Holy Water helps you, you'll end up doing it the entire game, just slowly progressing, and it takes you many extra hours in order to be able to complete the game if you don't know where the holes are ahead of time. But it also destroys random bricks and walls that are breakable. You can't break the bricks with your whip like you can in other Castlevania games. If you hit a brick that can break, you can break it with a whip. In this game, you have to throw the Holy Water in order to break it down. Now, this is actually the second town. We're just going to make a quick stop to buy, the second whip, which I mentioned I was going to buy. The third whip. I actually skipped the second whip altogether. Drop down. And yes, I want to buy a chain whip. Thank you very much. Okay, now that we have the chain whip, I won't have to purchase another whip for a little while. The Morning Star, which is the best whip until you get the upgraded Flame Whip, which is just the Morning Star but on fire, which we'll get that much later on in the run. But now that I've done that little bit of training, I've gotten a better whip. I have my Holy Water. It's now time to actually head to the very first dungeon, or in this game they're called mansions, which will be the location of the first piece of Dracula's body that we'll have to pick up. Overall, there are 5 mansions to go to in the game that collect 5 different body parts. Only 5. You don't have to get the rest of Dracula's body. Somehow you'll already have it, I guess. Maybe Simon was collecting for a while before he even decided these are the last 5 pieces he was missing, I guess. That's the only way I can really think about it. But after you get them, you go to the final area, the final mansion castle of the game, which is a rundown Castlevania castle, which is completely empty. There's no enemies. It's very disappointing for a final dungeon because it doesn't have anything in it. But anyway, that's the total of where we have to go in the game. Now, this is the very first dungeon mansion of the game. This is Berkeley Mansion. Inside of it, we will actually be getting a bone of Dracula's, which is actually a pretty good item because you can actually use it as a shield to deflect different enemy fires right back at them. So even though it's just one random bone, it ends up being a pretty useful bone. Now, in each mansion, the way you beat the mansion or whatever, kind of like some other games where you have to find certain items before you actually can go ahead and beat the mansion, is there is a random merchant inside of every single dungeon that sells an oak stake. Now, a big complaint about the game is once you get the oak stake, unless you read certain text, you're going to have no clue what the heck you're doing with the oak stake. But anyway, what the oak stake does, it allows you to hit an orb at the end of each of the dungeons, and by hitting it, a bag appears, and the bag contains the key item, the piece of Dracula for that castle. So, and you have to buy an oak stake in every single castle, and you have to use it in that castle. If you accidentally throw the oak stake and miss, or you just throw it randomly, it does not do any damage to enemies, you end up wasting it, and then you have to backtrack and buy another one. And since they do cost 50 hearts apiece, it's not necessarily the best thing to go ahead and just waste one. And of course, then if you do, you have to just sit there and grind